I realized I was lost, not when he first kissed me, but when he was just standing next to me by the window, and I felt the warmth of his body through the thin fabric of my dress. It was like static electricity, a subtle flutter on my skin that took my breath away. His presence in the room always felt like a change in atmospheric pressure. He wasn't perfect, but he was mine. His voice, low, with a slight rasp, felt like a safe place to hide from the world. We could sit in silence for hours, but that silence was never empty. It was filled with the sounds of his breathing, the occasional touch of his fingers on my wrist, the scent of his perfume, a mix of sandalwood and rain on hot asphalt. Every time his gaze rested on my lips, something inside me snapped. It wasn't just infatuation, it was an addiction at the cellular level. He was my home, my anchor, my personal sun, warming me so much that I didn't notice I was starting to burn. The first time I knew I was in trouble, it wasn't because of a grand gesture or a whispered vow under a moonlit sky. It was a Tuesday, unremarkable and gray, and he was simply standing by the window. The smell of rain on hot asphalt drifted in, mixing with the scent of his skin, sandalwood and something metallic, like the edge of a storm. I watched the way his shirt clung to the muscles of his back, the fabric pulling slightly as he reached up to rub his neck. He didn't even look at me, but I felt a pull so violent it was physical. It was gravity, a silent, invisible force that made every other person in the room feel like a blurry background actor. I realized then that I wasn't just in love, I was caught in his orbit, and the closer I got, the more the friction threatened to set me on fire. We didn't just have dates, we had shared silences that felt more intimate than most people's conversations. I remember the way he would look at me across a crowded table, not a smile, but a slow, heavy gaze that felt like a hand sliding down my spine. It was electric chemistry, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up before a single word is spoken. He became my home, but not the kind with four walls and a roof. He was the home you find in the specific rhythm of someone's heartbeat against your ear at 3 a.m., or the way his thumb would trace the map of my knuckles until I forgot my own name. There was a night when the power went out, and the apartment was swallowed by a thick, velvety darkness. We lay on the floor, the hardwood cool against our skin, while the flickering light of a single candle danced across his jawline. He leaned over me, his breath a warm ghost against my lips. He didn't kiss me immediately. Instead, he just hovered there, letting the tension build until it was a physical weight in my chest. "You're everywhere," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to echo in my very bones. In my head, under my skin. I don't know where I end and you begin anymore. That was the moment I should have been afraid. That was the moment I should have known that a love this heavy, this all-consuming, couldn't possibly stay afloat forever. We were gold, but gold is a heavy metal, and eventually, it sinks. The transition from the golden warmth of our beginning to the sterile, freezing blue of the end didn't happen with a scream. It happened in the microscopic details, the way the air in our bedroom suddenly felt too thin to breathe, and the way the light started to hit the walls like shards of broken glass. I was fading. It wasn't just a physical decline, it was as if my very soul was being bleached of its color. The fog I had heard others talk about wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal, heavy mist that sat in the back of my throat, tasting of copper and old dust. I would wake up in the middle of the night, my skin clammy and pale, feeling like a ghost trying to inhabit a body that no longer recognized its owner. I began to pull away, not because I loved him less, but because the shame of my own frailty felt like an anchor dragging me into the depths. I stopped looking at myself in the mirror because I didn't want to see the hollows beneath my eyes, but more than that, I didn't want to see him seeing them. The real turning point, the moment the floor truly dropped out from under us, was a Thursday evening in late October. The house was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the hallway, a sound that started to feel like a countdown. I was sitting on the edge of our bed, trying to pull on a silk robe, but my hands were shaking so violently I couldn't even find the sleeves. The fabric, once a symbol of our late-night intimacy, now felt like lead. He walked into the room, stopping in the doorway. Usually, his entrance was marked by that electric, hungry heat, that look that said he wanted to consume me whole. But that night, the fire was gone. He stood there, silhouetted against the cold light of the hallway, and I saw it, the shift. His eyes traveled over the sharp protruding lines of my collarbone, the way my skin seemed stretched too tight over my frame, and for the first time in our history, he didn't look at me with desire. He looked at me with pity. It was a devastating, clinical kind of sympathy that felt colder than any rejection. It was the look you give a wounded animal you know won't survive the winter. The silence between us stretched, becoming a vast, insurmountable canyon. He didn't come to me. He didn't wrap his arms around me to stop the shaking. He just stood there, his shadow long and jagged on the floor, and I realized that the man who used to worship my body was now afraid to touch it. The atmosphere in our home shifted from gold to a bruising, icy blue. Every touch from that moment on felt performative, a duty rather than a craving. When he did reach out, his fingers were hesitant, as if he were afraid I might shatter into 1,000 porcelain shards under the slightest pressure. We stopped sleeping tangled together. Instead, we lay on opposite edges of the king-sized bed, a vast desert of white linen between us, both of us staring at the ceiling in the dark. I could hear his breath, heavy, jagged, and full of unspoken words. I wanted to scream, to tell him to hate me, to fight with me, to do anything other than look at me with that heartbreaking, distant sorrow. But the fog was too thick. I was becoming a memory before I was even gone, a flickering light in a room where the windows had been left open to the storm. I could feel him mourning me while I was still breathing right next to him, and that silent grief was more suffocating than any illness could ever be. The man who used to be my anchor was slowly becoming a ghost, drifting through the rooms of our apartment like a stranger who had lost his way. It wasn't that he stopped caring, it was that his care had become a weapon, a sharp, cold blade of efficiency that cut through the last remnants of our intimacy. He moved with a mechanical precision that terrified me. Every morning, the sound of the kettle whistling was no longer a call to wake up and share a moment, it was a signal that another day of endurance had begun. I would watch him from the bed, my body feeling like it was made of lead, as he moved through the kitchen. He didn't whistle anymore. He didn't dance to the radio. He just existed, a silhouette of the man I once knew, framed by the gray morning light that felt more like a shroud than a sunrise. His transformation was subtle at first, then devastatingly complete. He was fighting a war against my condition, against the inevitable fading of my spark, but in doing so, he was losing the very essence of himself. I started to notice the quiet screams, the moments when the pressure became too much to contain. I saw it in the way he gripped the steering wheel when we drove home from another appointment, his knuckles so white they looked like polished bone, his jaw set so tight I feared his teeth might shatter. He would stare straight ahead, eyes fixed on the road with a haunted intensity, as if he could outrun the tragedy if he just drove fast enough. He wouldn't look at me. Not because he didn't want to, but because he couldn't bear to see his own failure reflected in my eyes. The silence in our home became a living thing, a heavy, suffocating entity that sat between us at the dinner table. We would eat in a rhythmic, soul-crushing quiet, the only sound being the clink of silverware against porcelain, a sound that felt like a needle scratching a record. I wanted to reach out, to touch the back of his hand, to tell him that it was okay to be broken, but my fingers felt frozen. He had built a wall of stoicism so high that I couldn't see over it anymore. He was becoming a martyr, and there is nothing more lonely than being loved by a martyr. He was sacrificing his joy, his sleep, his very identity on the altar of my survival, and I hated him for it. I hated that I was the reason the man who used to laugh until the windows shook was now reduced to a series of grim nods and hollow stares. One night, I found him in the living room, sitting in total darkness. The only light came from the street lamp outside, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. He wasn't doing anything. He was just staring into the void, his shoulders slumped in a way that made him look small, fragile. I stood in the doorway, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to go to him, to wrap my arms around his neck and whisper that I was still here, still the woman he loved. But I stayed in the shadows. I watched him bury his face in his hands, his chest heaving with a silent, racking sob that never made a sound. It was the most heartbreaking thing I had ever seen, the sight of a strong man breaking in the dark, refusing to let the world, or the woman he was dying for, see his pain. He wouldn't leave. He wouldn't give up. But as I backed away into the hallway, I realized that while he was fighting to keep me alive, he was slowly, methodically, killing the man I had fallen in love with. The air in the apartment had become a thick, pressurized liquid, the kind that makes every movement feel like you're fighting against an invisible tide. The rain didn't just fall that evening, it attacked the glass, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that seemed to mirror the erratic beating of my heart. I was lying on the sofa, draped in a heavy wool blanket that smelled of the cedar chest and the slow decay of our better years. He was in the other room, moving with that heavy, methodical gait that had become his signature. I heard it then, the sound of something heavy being moved, the scrape of wood against wood. He was in the closet, the one place I thought was safe from his clinical, obsessive tidying. Then came the silence. It wasn't the usual quiet of our home, it was a vacuum, a sudden drop in pressure that made my ears pop. I heard the vintage leather camera case, the one my father had given me, the one I used to store the things too heavy for the heart to carry, hit the floor with a dull, final thud. He walked into the living room. He didn't look like the man who had brought me tea an hour ago. He looked like a statue carved from cold, gray salt. In his hand, he held the medical files I had stolen from the clinic, the ones that laid out the truth in brutal, uncompromising black and white. Not just the illness, but the choice I had made, the DNR order, the refusal of the experimental treatment that would have cost us our home and his sanity, the secret bank account I'd been draining to ensure he had a future after I was gone. He held the detective story of my betrayal in his trembling fingers, the papers crinkling like dry leaves in a storm. "How long?" he asked. His voice wasn't a shout. It was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a falling mountain. He stood over me, the blue light from the television flickering across his face, making him look like a stranger from a noir film. "How long have you been planning your exit without me?" The confrontation was devastatingly quiet. I tried to speak, to explain the mercy of my lies, but the words felt like jagged glass in my throat. He dropped to his knees beside the sofa, not to comfort me, but because his legs seemed to have failed him. He gripped the edges of the medical file so hard the skin on his knuckles split. "You thought you were protecting me?" he hissed, his eyes finally meeting mine, burning with a mix of fury and a soul-crushing betrayal. "You decided for us? You let me watch you die a little more every day, thinking I was failing to save you, while you had already signed the papers to let go?" The rain outside intensified, a chaotic roar that drowned out the world. In that moment, the hushed intimacy of our love was replaced by something raw and ugly. He looked at the documents, then back at me, and I saw a terrifying shift in his gaze. The pity was gone. The sorrow was gone. In its place was a cold, terrifying resolve. He didn't care about my choice anymore. He didn't care about the ethics or the peace I had tried to curate. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, his breath smelling of bitter coffee and desperation. "I don't care what you signed," he whispered, his voice vibrating with a dark, dangerous power. "I am not letting you go. Not like this. Not for a lie." He made a choice in that moment, a choice that bypassed my will, a choice that involved a phone call to a contact he'd kept hidden, a choice that would save my body but might finish off whatever was left of his soul. The man I loved was gone, in his place was a man who would burn the world down just to keep the embers of my life glowing. Part 5, The Cost of Devotion. The recovery was a blur of sterile white lights, the smell of antiseptic that seemed to stain the back of my tongue, and the constant, rhythmic hum of machines that sounded like the heartbeat of a god. I was back. The fog had been forcibly lifted, the shadows retreated from my lungs, and my skin began to regain that warm, golden hue he used to worship. But the man who sat in the chair beside my bed every night was not the man who had traced my collarbone in the dark of a summer storm. He was harder now. His shoulders were set in a permanent line of combat, and his eyes, those beautiful, expressive eyes, were like shutters pulled tight against the sun. He had done it. He had navigated the gray markets of medicine, traded favors I didn't want to know about, and spent every cent of the money I had tried to save for his future. He had saved me, but the cost was written in the new lines around his mouth and the way he flinched at sudden noises. When we finally returned home, the apartment felt like a museum dedicated to a war we had both lost. He would move through the rooms with a possessive, almost frantic energy, constantly checking the locks, checking my pulse, checking the expiration dates on the bottles of pills that lined our vanity like a row of plastic soldiers. The intimacy we once shared had morphed into something heavy and transactional. Every time he touched me, I felt the weight of the debt. When his hand brushed mine, I didn't feel the electric spark of part one, I felt the crushing gravity of what he had sacrificed. I would look at him across the dinner table, the silence now filled with the clinking of forks and the unspoken reality of his moral grade transition, and I would feel a wave of survivor's guilt so profound it made it hard to swallow. I was alive, yes. I could breathe, I could walk, I could dream. Man I loved, the one who laughed at the rain and whispered secrets into the crook of my neck, had died on the night he found that camera case. He had become my jailer in the guise of a savior. He watched me with a hunger that wasn't about desire, but about maintenance. I was his masterpiece, his hard-won victory against the void, and he wouldn't let me out of his sight. I realized then that love, in its most extreme form, isn't a soft thing. It's a brutal, selfish force. He had saved the vessel, but in the process, he had shattered the man inside himself. I would catch him staring at his own reflection in the hallway mirror, his hand trembling as he adjusted his collar, and I knew he was looking for a person who no longer existed. We were two strangers living in a house built of glass and scars, tied together by a devotion that felt more like a sentence than a sanctuary. I was saved, but I was mourning him every single day. Part 6, The Beauty of the Scar. We live in the happily ever-changed now. There are no more crises, no more hidden files, and the rain on the asphalt has returned to being just a weather pattern rather than a harbinger of doom. But the atmosphere of our lives has permanently shifted. We move around each other with the careful grace of two people walking on a frozen lake, knowing exactly where the ice is thin. Our love isn't a bright, golden thing anymore, it's a scar. It's thick, it's jagged, and it's permanent. It's the kind of beauty that only comes from being broken and fused back together with something stronger, and colder, than what was there before. In the quiet moments, when the flickering light in the hallway hums its low, electric tune, I look at him and realize that I don't know the man who sits across from me. I know his habits, I know his scent, I know the way he takes his coffee. I don't know the thoughts that haunt him in the small hours of the morning when he thinks I'm asleep. He has become a man of shadows, a man who knows the price of a soul because he paid his own to keep mine in this world. And yet, there is a strange, haunting beauty in this version of us. It's a love stripped of its vanity, stripped of its happily ever after illusions. It's the raw, ugly truth of what it means to belong to someone. I used to think love was about staying whole, about two people coming together to create a perfect circle. I was wrong. Love is about the person who is willing to break with you. It's about the person who will reach into the fire to pull you out, even if it means their own hands are burned beyond recognition. We are not the people we were in part one. We are older, we are scarred, and we are morally exhausted. But when he reaches out in the dark and finds my hand, gripping it with a fierce, desperate strength, I know that this is the only truth that matters. He saved my life, and in return, I am the keeper of his ghosts. We don't talk about the man he used to be, just like we don't talk about the fog that almost took me. We simply exist in this bittersweet plateau, two survivors of a war that only we can remember. It isn't the story I would have written for us, but it's the only one that's real. As I watch him close his eyes, the moonlight catching the new gray in his hair, I realize that the greatest tragedy isn't dying, it's being the only one left to remember how beautiful the man you loved used to be before he had to save you. Love isn't about who stays whole, it's about who is willing to be ruined with you. The recovery was not the triumphant sunrise the movies promised. It was a cold, clinical resurrection that smelled of bleach and scorched earth. When the fog finally lifted, driven out by treatments I knew we couldn't afford and methods he wouldn't name, I didn't wake up to the man from part one. The gravity was gone, replaced by a hardened, jagged iron. He had spent months navigating the moral sewers of the world to keep me breathing, and the cost was etched into every line of his face. He was thinner, his eyes permanently bloodshot, his hands possessing a new, frantic tremor that he tried to hide by clenching them into fists. I was saved. My lungs drew in air without effort, my skin regained its warmth, and the translucent, ghostly version of me retreated into the past. But as I sat across from him at the dinner table, the silence was no longer our sanctuary, it was a graveyard. I looked at him and felt a crushing, suffocating wave of survivor's guilt. Every breath I took felt like a coin stolen from his soul. He had become morally gray, a man who had traded his light for my life. He didn't look at me with desire anymore, he looked at me like a precious, fragile trophy he had climbed through hell to retrieve. His touch had changed. It was no longer a caress, it was a possessive grip, a frantic checking of my pulse, as if he expected me to evaporate the moment he let go. The man who used to whisper poetry into the crook of my neck was replaced by a soldier who had seen too much. He moved through our apartment with a heavy, defensive gait, constantly checking the locks, his eyes darting to every shadow. He had saved me, but in doing so, he had destroyed the person I loved. We were living in a house built from the wreckage of his innocence. I realized with a sickening jolt that I was alive because he had burnt his own house down to keep me warm. I wanted to thank him, to scream at him, to hold him until he became soft again, but there was nothing soft left. I was a living monument to his sacrifice, and he was a stranger wearing my husband's skin. We were tethered by a debt that could never be repaid, staring at each other across a chasm of things that could never be undone. Part 6, The Beauty of the Scar. We don't talk about the before anymore. To speak of it would be to acknowledge the magnitude of what we lost in the fire. We live in the after, a quiet, bittersweet plateau where the air is always a little too still. There are no happily ever afters in our world, only happily ever changed. Our love isn't a golden glow, it's a scar. Thick, tough, and slightly numb to the touch, but permanent. It's the kind of love that doesn't bloom in a garden, but survives in the cracks of a sidewalk, feeding on grit and gray rainwater. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I feel him watching me. I don't turn around. I know he's there, sitting in the darkness, listening to the rhythm of my heart as if it's a ticking clock he's tasked with keeping wound. We aren't whole. We are broken pieces held together by the sheer, brutal force of his will. But there is a haunting, cinematic beauty in that brokenness. It's a love stripped of all its vanity, all its pretty lies. It's the raw, ugly truth of what happens when one person refuses to let the other go, even when the universe demands it. I used to think love was about staying whole together. I was wrong. Love is about who is willing to break with you. It's about the person who will walk into the dark, lose their way, and become a monster just to make sure you find the light. The man from part 1 is a ghost, and I am the only one left to mourn him. But the man who remains, the scarred, silent, morally exhausted man, is the one who chose me over his own salvation. As the light flickers in our hallway, casting long, distorted shadows, I realize that we are bound by something stronger than passion. We are bound by the ruins of who we used to be. He saved my life, but in the end, I'm the only one left to remember the man he was before he had to become my savior.
Subscribe, like, and tell people about this love.